The thunderous hoofbeats kicked up clouds of dust against the bleeding sunset as Margaret Winters clutched the reins of her stolen mare, her heart pounding as fiercely as the animal beneath her. Behind her, the life she was meant to live, a wealthy banker's wife in Boston society, grew smaller with each desperate gallop westward. Ahead lay nothing but uncertainty, and the promise of freedom, a promise worth more to her than all the security her father's arrangements could provide. "You can't outrun who you are, girl," her father had warned when she discovered his deal with Bartholomew Sinclair, a man 3 decades her senior with cold eyes and colder hands. Some birds weren't meant to fly free, but Margaret had looked him dead in the eyes, defiance blazing, and whispered, "Watch me." Now, with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small pouch of coins sewn into her petticoat, and her mother's locket hanging from her neck, she rode toward the setting sun, toward a place where names and histories could be shed like autumn leaves, a place where a woman might craft her own destiny. Little did she know that destiny had already charted a collision course with a man equally determined to escape his past. Luke Callahan's hands still remembered the weight of his Colt revolver long after he'd buried it beneath an old oak tree outside of Redemption Creek. 5 notches carved into its handle, 5 lives taken in self-defense according to the law. But the nightmares told a different story. Now, his calloused hands wrapped around the smooth wood of a hammer instead, driving nails into the frame of what would become the town's new schoolhouse. "You're building it too sturdy, Callahan," Sheriff Wilkes chuckled, leaning against a nearby post, "like you expect it to withstand an ambush." Luke didn't look up from his work, the rhythmic pounding of the hammer drowning out his thoughts. "Everything I build stands the test of time, Sheriff. Unlike some things in this town." The sheriff's smile faltered. They both knew what Luke meant. Redemption Creek had promised exactly what its name suggested, a chance for men like Luke to start anew. But the whispers followed him still, the sideways glances whenever trouble stirred. "The fastest gun in the Colorado Territory doesn't simply hang up his holster," they said. "A killer's instincts don't fade like morning dew." "Just remember," Wilkes said, pushing off from the post, "second chances aren't guaranteed. This town has a long memory." As the sheriff walked away, Luke's hammer struck with renewed force. He'd prove them wrong, build something lasting, something good with his hands. The same hands that had once dealt death would now create life. Schools, homes, futures. That's when he spotted her, a figure wavering on horseback at the edge of town, silhouetted against the last crimson streaks of daylight. Even from a distance he could see she was barely staying upright. Luke dropped his hammer without a second thought. Margaret had been riding for 3 days straight, sleeping in short, fitful bursts beneath the stars, rationing her water until her lips cracked and her throat felt like sandpaper. The little mining town appeared like a mirage through her exhaustion-blurred vision, a cluster of wooden buildings and lantern light, promising respite. But her body had reached its limit. As the tired mare slowed at the town's edge, Margaret felt herself sliding sideways, the world tilting at an impossible angle. The ground rushed up to meet her, but instead of the hard impact she expected, she felt strong arms break her fall. "Whoa there," a deep voice rumbled, steady as bedrock. "I've got you." Through the haze of dehydration and fatigue, Margaret registered a face weathered by sun and hardship, yet somehow gentle, eyes the color of a storm-washed sky, the strong scent of sawdust and honest sweat. "Don't," she managed to whisper, her voice a brittle leaf. "Don't send me back." Then darkness claimed her, but not before she felt herself being lifted, cradled against a broad chest as carefully as if she were made of fine china. "She's running from something," Doc Harris said, closing his medical bag after examining the unconscious woman Luke had carried to his cabin. "Or someone. Exhaustion, dehydration. She rode that mare half to death." Luke stood at the foot of his bed where she lay, her face finally peaceful in sleep, her chestnut hair spread across his pillow like a fan. He'd never brought a woman to his home before. The town would talk. "Will she be all right?" he asked, surprised by the concern in his own voice. The old doctor nodded. "With rest and care. Lucky you found her when you did." He paused, studying Luke with shrewd eyes. "Sheriff should probably be informed." "No." The word shot from Luke's mouth before he could stop it. At the doctor's raised eyebrow, he added more calmly, "Let's wait until she wakes. Hear her story first." After Doc Harris left, Luke settled into the chair beside the bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. The woman's hands were soft, uncollused, not a frontier woman. But something in the determined set of her jaw, even in unconsciousness, told him she was stronger than she appeared. He recognized the look of someone fleeing ghosts. It stared back at him from his own mirror each morning. "We all deserve a second chance," he whispered to the sleeping stranger. "Even you, even me." Outside, the wind whispered through the pines as night wrapped its velvet cloak around Redemption Creek, and for the first time in years, Luke felt the stirring of something dangerously close to hope. Margaret woke to unfamiliar surroundings, panic seizing her throat, until her eyes adjusted to the soft morning light, filtering through simple muslin curtains. A cabin, small but meticulously kept. She lay in a bed with clean linens that smelled of sunshine, and someone had removed her dirty traveling clothes, leaving her in her camise. Alarmed, she clutched the blanket to her chest as the door opened, and a man entered, carrying a steaming mug. Recognition flickered, the face from before she fainted. "You're awake," he said, his voice low and careful, as if speaking to a spooked horse. He set the mug on the bedside table, and stepped back, giving her space. "Willow bark tea. Doc Harris says it'll help with the headache you're likely feeling." Margaret studied him warily, tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean strength of a man who worked with his body rather than commanded others with mere words. His face was sun-browned and lined at the corners of his eyes, though he couldn't be much past 30. There was something in his steady gaze that didn't match his rough exterior, a gentleness, a shadow of something deeper. "Where am I?" she managed, her voice a rasp. "Redemption Creek. About as close to nowhere as you can get while still being somewhere." The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "I'm Luke Callahan. Found you nearly tumbling off your horse yesterday evening." "My horse, stabled and fed. Better off than you were." He nodded toward the tea. "Drink. Then we can talk about what brings a Boston society lady to the edge of the wilderness half dead." Her eyes widened. "How did you? Your accent, the quality of your riding clothes, and that locket." He nodded toward the silver pendant resting against her collarbone. "That's fine craftsmanship, not something you'd find out here." Margaret's hand flew protectively to the locket, her mother's last gift before consumption had taken her. Inside was a tiny portrait, and a lock of her mother's hair, her last tangible connection to a woman who had taught her that a life without passion was no life at all. "My name is Margaret," she offered, seeing no reason to lie about that much, "and I'd rather not discuss Boston." Luke studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Fair enough. Everyone in Redemption Creek has something they'd rather not discuss." He turned to leave. "There's a dress on the chair that might fit you. Belongs to the widow Hanson. Rest today. Tomorrow's soon enough to decide your next move." At the door he paused without turning. "No one here will send you back, Margaret. Whatever you're running from, you're safe for now." When he was gone, Margaret reached trembling fingers for the tea, surprised to find tears streaming down her face. How long had it been since anyone had offered her safety without conditions? As the warm liquid soothed her raw throat, she gazed around the simple cabin. Everything functional, built with care, nothing frivolous. Like its owner, it made no pretenses. For the first time in weeks, the knot of tension between her shoulder blades began to loosen. Word spread quickly through Redemption Creek that Luke Callahan was harboring a mysterious woman in his cabin. By midday, 3 different wives from town had appeared at his door with covered dishes and transparent excuses, each leaving with disappointed expressions when Luke didn't invite them in to gawk at his guest. He was replacing a loose board on his porch when Sheriff Wilkes sauntered up the path, thumbs hooked in his belt. Becoming quite the topic of conversation, Callahan, the sheriff drawled. Luke straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. Thought this town would have more important matters to discuss than the former gunslinger playing nursemaid to some runaway. Not likely. Wilkes studied the cabin with narrowed eyes. Who is she? Just a traveler who ran into trouble. Uh-huh. And I suppose the telegram I received this morning about a missing Boston heiress is just coincidence. Luke's hammer froze mid-swing. What telegram? The sheriff's mouth curved into a knowing smile. Margaret Winters, only daughter of banking magnate Harold Winters, disappeared 3 nights before her wedding to one of Boston's most eligible bachelors. He watched Luke's face carefully. Reward for information leading to her return is substantial. Luke's jaw tightened as he set down his tools. Is there a law against a woman changing her mind about marriage? When there's a contract signed and money exchanged, some might call it breach of promise. The sheriff shrugged. Not my jurisdiction, of course, but if she's here, well, it would be my duty to inform the proper authorities. She's recovering from exhaustion, Luke said evenly, hardly in a condition to travel. Wilkes nodded slowly. I'll give her 3 days, then I'll need to speak with her official-like. He turned to leave, then added over his shoulder, word of advice, Callahan, don't get attached. High-born ladies don't belong in places like this, and men with your history don't get happy endings. Luke watched him go, a familiar coldness settling in his stomach. The sheriff was right. Whatever had brought Margaret Winters to Redemption Creek, it wasn't a desire for a life among rough people in a rougher land, especially not with a man whose hands still remembered the weight of a gun more naturally than they held a hammer. But as he returned to his work, Luke couldn't ignore the voice whispering that for once, just once, maybe the ending could be different. By evening, Margaret had regained enough strength to sit on the porch, wrapped in a quilt against the mountain chill. Luke had built a small fire in the pit before the cabin, the flames casting dancing shadows across the darkening yard. Your sheriff paid a visit today, Luke said, prodding the fire with a stick. Margaret tensed. And he received a telegram about a missing Boston heiress. He glanced at her, firelight reflecting in his eyes. Margaret Winters. She closed her eyes briefly, shoulders slumping. How long do I have? 3 days before he feels obliged to report your whereabouts. Luke set the stick down. Want to tell me why Harold Winters' daughter would flee an advantageous marriage to hide in a mining town at the edge of nowhere? Margaret's laugh was brittle. Advantageous for whom? For my father, certainly. For Bartholomew Sinclair, who gains controlling interest in my father's bank through our union. Her fingers tightened around the quilt. For me, I'd rather take my chances with coyotes and bandits than be that man's possession. Most women would consider security and wealth worth the sacrifice. Her eyes flashed. Would you sacrifice your freedom for comfort, Mr. Callahan? Would you cage yourself willingly? The question hung between them, and something shifted in Luke's expression. No, he said softly, I wouldn't. Silence stretched between them, comfortable as the quilt around her shoulders. In the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon, its cry hauntingly beautiful in its loneliness. What will you do? Luke finally asked. Margaret gazed at the stars emerging above the pines. Keep moving west, I suppose. Find somewhere to start over. As what? No offense, but frontier life requires skills I'm guessing weren't part of your Boston education. She smiled faintly. I can read and write better than most. I play piano. I speak French and a little Spanish. At his skeptical look, she added defiantly, I can learn whatever else I need to know. Luke studied her for a long moment, the firelight softening his weathered features. Town needs a school teacher. Previous one left after finding gold wasn't just in the streams but in the pockets of San Francisco merchants. Margaret blinked in surprise. A school teacher. Building's nearly finished. Children are running wild. Parents would pay. He shrugged as if it were nothing, though they both knew it was everything. Could give you time to figure out your next move, if you were interested. Hope fluttered in Margaret's chest, fragile as a butterfly's wing. You would do that for me? Why? Luke's eyes met hers across the flames, and something electric passed between them. Maybe I believe everyone deserves a second chance at writing their own story. He stood, brushing off his pants. Think about it. I'll be turning in. You can take the bed again. I'm fine out here. As he moved past her toward the cabin, Margaret caught his wrist. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, and she felt him go utterly still at her touch. Thank you, she whispered, meaning it more than any words she'd ever spoken. For a breathless moment, he looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face, something unnamed and powerful passing between them. Get some rest, Margaret, he said, his voice rougher than before. Dawn comes early in these mountains. She watched him disappear into the cabin, her hand still tingling where it had touched him. For the first time since fleeing Boston, Margaret felt something other than fear and desperation, something that felt dangerously like belonging. The next morning, Luke took Margaret to see the schoolhouse. Still partly skeletal, its beams reached toward the clear blue sky like ribs of some great beast. Yet even unfinished, she could see the care in its construction, the perfectly squared corners, the solid foundation. You built this? She asked, running her hand along a smooth planed beam. Luke nodded, watching her explore, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Been working on it for 2 months now. Town pitched in for materials. It's beautiful, she said, meaning it. Solid, that's the idea. Build things that last. There was something wistful in his voice that made her turn to look at him. Is that why you came here? To build things? His eyes met hers, then drifted away. Partly. Mostly came to leave other things behind. Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders appeared at the edge of town, dust billowing behind them. Even at a distance, their demeanor spoke of trouble. The cocky set of their shoulders, the deliberate slowness of their approach. Luke's entire body language changed in an instant. The easy carpenter vanished, replaced by a man coiled tight as a spring, eyes narrowed and watchful. Get inside, he said quietly. Who are they? Trouble. The Jenkins brothers, local outlaws who fancy themselves the law around these parts. His jaw tightened. They shake down the miners and businesses for protection. Sheriff Wilkes turns a blind eye. Rumor is he gets a cut. Margaret frowned. But you don't pay them. The corner of Luke's mouth twitched. Let's just say we have an understanding. They leave me alone. I leave them breathing. He nodded toward the schoolhouse frame. Go inside. Find something to busy yourself with. She wanted to protest but recognized the steel in his voice. This wasn't the gentle builder speaking, but someone else entirely. Someone who expected to be obeyed when danger threatened. From inside the skeletal building, Margaret watched as the 3 men dismounted before Luke. Even from a distance, she could see the family resemblance, all tall and rangy, with the same cruel set to their mouths. The oldest, sporting a beard streaked with gray, did the talking while the others flanked him like wolves. She couldn't hear their words, but their body language told the story. The accusatory jab of the leader's finger toward Luke. The casual way the youngest brother's hand rested near his holster. The tension radiating from Luke's shoulders, even as his stance remained relaxed, deceptively so. When the leader stepped closer, invading Luke's space, Margaret held her breath. But Luke didn't back up, didn't flinch. Instead, he said something that made the outlaw stop short, his face darkening with anger. For a heart-stopping moment, Margaret thought violence would erupt. Then surprisingly, the leader laughed, a harsh sound without humor, and stepped back. He said something else, glancing toward the schoolhouse. Luke's response was immediate and forceful, his fingers stabbing the air between them. Whatever he said made the brothers exchange looks before the leader spat on the ground at Luke's feet. They mounted their horses and rode away, but not before the youngest turned back to look directly at the schoolhouse, as if he knew Margaret was watching. Only when they were out of sight did Luke's shoulders drop slightly. He stood there for a long moment before turning toward the schoolhouse, his face grim. What was that about? Margaret asked, when he stepped inside. They're curious about you. Luke's voice was flat. Word travels fast. They wanted to know if you were worth anything. A chill ran through her. What did you tell them? That you're the new school teacher, and under my protection. His eyes met hers, hard as flint. They'll be back. They always come back. You're not telling me everything, she pressed. The way they looked at you, they're afraid of you. Why? Luke was silent. For so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then because they know what I was before I came here. What I can still be if pushed. He picked up a hammer, turning it over in his hands. There are things about me you should know, Margaret. Things that might make you reconsider staying. Tell me, she said softly. So he did, standing in the half-built schoolhouse with dust motes dancing in the sunbeams between them. Luke Callahan told her about the gunfighter he'd once been, the notorious ghost so named because his victims never saw him coming. 5 men dead by his hand, all in fair fights, according to the law, but each death another weight on his soul until he couldn't bear it anymore. I was young and angry, and thought being feared meant being respected, he said, not meeting her eyes. Took me too long to realize the difference. When he finally looked at her, expecting disgust or fear, he found neither. Instead, Margaret stepped closer, her eyes searching his. We've all done things we regret, she said quietly. The question is whether those things define us forever. Their eyes held, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, understanding, possibility. The moment was shattered by a gunshot in the distance, followed by shouting. "Stay here," Luke ordered, already moving toward the door. But Margaret had spent her life being told where to stay and what to do. Without a word, she followed him into the sunlight. Chaos greeted them at the town's center. A crowd had gathered outside the saloon where the Jenkins brothers were dragging a bloodied miner into the street. The young man, barely more than a boy, was pleading with them, his face a mask of terror. "Caught him stealing from our claim," the eldest Jenkins announced to the crowd. "You all know the punishment for claim jumpers." The sheriff stood nearby, his face impassive. "Now Roy, let's not be hasty. Shut your mouth, Wilkes, unless you want everyone knowing exactly how deep in our pocket you are." Roy Jenkins snarled. He drew his pistol, pressing it to the young miner's temple. "Make an example of him now. Save us trouble later." Luke pushed through the crowd, his voice cutting through the tension. "That's not your land, Jenkins. That claim belongs to the Harper family, and you know it." Roy's eyes narrowed as he turned to face Luke. "Stay out of this, Callahan. Your protection doesn't extend to thieves." "He's not a thief. He's a legal hand hired by the Harpers." Luke moved closer, each step deliberate. "Put the gun down." Margaret watched the transformation with a mixture of fascination and fear. Gone was the quiet builder. In his place stood a man who radiated lethal capability, whose every movement spoke of tightly leashed violence. This was the man who had earned the name Ghost, and suddenly she understood why. "You going to make me?" Roy sneered, but Margaret didn't miss the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You ain't even wearing a gun." "Don't need one," Luke said quietly. "Last chance, Roy. Walk away." For a breathless moment, the entire town waited, caught in the grip of the standoff. Then Roy did something unforgivable. He smiled, and swung his gun toward Margaret. "Maybe I'll take your woman instead. Seems fair trade." What happened next occurred so quickly, Margaret would later struggle to recall the sequence. Luke moved with impossible speed. There was a blur of motion, a sharp crack that wasn't a gunshot, and suddenly Roy Jenkins was on his knees, screaming as Luke held his wrist at an unnatural angle. The outlaw's gun lay in the dust. The other brothers reached for their weapons, but Luke's voice stopped them cold. "Draw and you're both dead before your guns clear leather." The calm certainty in his tone left no room for doubt. "You know what I can do. You know I won't miss." The oldest brother hesitated, then slowly raised his hands. The youngest followed suit, white-faced. Luke twisted Roy's wrist a fraction more, making him howl. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave this town, and you're not coming back. You're going to forget about your protections business. If I ever see any of you within 10 miles of Redemption Creek again, I will end you." He leaned closer to Roy's ear. "And unlike the men I've killed before, your deaths won't weigh on me at all." He released Roy's wrist with a shove, sending the outlaw sprawling in the dust. For a moment hatred and humiliation warred on the man's face, and Margaret feared he might do something foolish despite Luke's warning. Instead, Roy climbed painfully to his feet, cradling his injured wrist. "This ain't over, Callahan." "Yes it is," Luke replied evenly. "Unless you want the telegraph operator to send word to Cheyenne about the stage robbery last month. I'm sure the territorial marshal would be mighty interested in that information." The blood drained from Roy's face. Without another word, he and his brothers mounted their horses and rode out of town. But not before Roy cast one final venomous glance at Margaret that promised retribution. As the dust settled, the townsfolk stared at Luke with a mixture of fear, awe, and gratitude. The sheriff approached, his expression unreadable. "Then perhaps that too is an answer." Her expression was solemn but tender. "But I believe in you, Joshua Blackwood. I believe the spirits led us to you that night for a reason greater than either of us yet understands." The decision crystallized in his heart. "I'll do it." What neither of them could know was that their conversation had not gone unheard. A figure slipped away from the shadows, moving silently toward the horses. 2 days later, Joshua was deep in preparation for the ceremony under Mafia Luta's guidance. He had begun fasting, purifying himself in the sweat lodge, learning the sacred songs he would sing during his solitary vigil on the hilltop. The camp's routine continued around him. women preparing hides and food for the coming winter, children playing among the teepees, warriors tending to their weapons and horses. Few noticed the growing tension in Akecheta, whose newfound respect for Joshua seemed to be warring with some inner conflict. That afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the camp's tranquility shattered. A young scout rode in hard, his horse lathered and heaving. "Soldiers," he cried out in Lakota, coming from the east. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Warriors grabbed weapons, women hurried children into teepees, horses were gathered. Joshua found Wikipe outside her father's lodge, her face tight with worry. "How many?" he asked. "A small party, perhaps 20, she replied. "But why here? Why now?" The answer came in the form of a voice Joshua had hoped never to hear again. "That's far enough, Chief," called Hollister, his nasal twang carrying across the suddenly silent camp. He sat atop a bay horse, flanked by a lieutenant and a dozen blue-coated soldiers. His beard had grown longer, but his eyes still held the same calculating greed. Joshua remembered. "We ain't here for trouble, just for a killer and thief." The Lakota warriors formed a protective semicircle before their families, bows drawn, lances at the ready. Mafia Luta stepped forward, his dignity undiminished by the threat before him. "There are no killers or thieves here," he said in clear English. "Only Lakota who wish to live in peace on the land the Great Spirit gave us." Hollister's laugh was ugly. "Peace, while you harbor a white man who murdered his partner and stole his gold." He scanned the faces of the gathered Lakota. "Joshua Blackwood, show yourself, you coward. Or do you hide behind women and children now?" Joshua stepped forward, anger burning through his veins. "The only murderer here is you, Hollister. You shot me and left me for dead." "That's not how I recall it," Hollister sneered. "Lieutenant, that's the man I told you about. Killed my friend Mitchell in cold blood, stole our claim papers, and ran off to hide with the savages." Young lieutenant looked uncomfortable but resolute. "Mr. Blackwood, I have a warrant for your arrest. Please come peacefully, and no harm will come to these people." "He's lying," Joshua said, addressing the officer directly. "There was no Mitchell, it was just Hollister and me. He shot me when we found gold, wanting the claim for himself." "Sad to see how living with Indians has affected your mind, Joshua," Hollister said with mock sympathy. "Mitchell's family deserves justice." He turned to the lieutenant. "He's not coming willingly, sir." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Joshua knew that if shots were fired, blood would flow on both sides. The Lakota would fight to the death to protect their own, and somehow, against all odds, he had become one of them. "Wait," Joshua said, raising his hands. "I'll come. No one needs to get hurt today." "Joshua, no." Wikipe moved to his side, clutching his arm. He turned to her, his voice low and urgent. "Trust me, I can't let people die because of Hollister's lies." "A wise decision," the lieutenant said, visibly relieved. "You'll get a fair trial in Deadwood." "Fair?" Joshua laughed bitterly. "With Hollister's gold buying witnesses and judges, we both know how this ends, Lieutenant." Before the officer could respond, a voice called out in Lakota. Akecheta stepped forward, addressing Mafia Luta, but loud enough for all to hear. When he finished speaking, a murmur ran through the gathered Lakota. "What's he saying?" the lieutenant demanded nervously. Mafia Luta's face was grave as he turned to Joshua. "Akecheta says he followed you 2 nights ago. He heard you confess to finding gold with this man, and to fleeing rather than facing white man's justice." The betrayal hit Joshua like a physical blow. He stared at Akecheta, whose expression remained impassive. "That's not what happened," Joshua protested, switching to the Lakota language he'd worked so hard to learn. "I said Hollister shot me after we found gold. He left me to die." But doubt had been cast. He could see it in the faces of some of the warriors who had only recently begun to accept him. "Looks like even your Indian friends know you're lying," Hollister said smugly. "Let's go, Joshua. Time to pay for your crimes." Joshua looked at Wikipe, whose eyes shone with unshed tears and unwavering belief. Then at Mafia Luta, whose expression was unreadable. Finally, at Akecheta, whose gaze now held something complex, regret mingled with resolve. With a heavy heart, Joshua walked toward the soldiers. "I'll be back," he said to Wicopee in Lakota. "I promise. I'll hold you to that." "Wotsichu," she replied, forcing a smile through her tears. As the soldiers bound his hands and placed him on a spare mount, Joshua caught Akecheta's eye one last time. In that moment, a silent communication passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the seed of understanding. What the warrior could not have known was that in betraying Joshua, he had unwittingly set in motion events that would test not only the white man's commitment to his newfound people, but the very future of the Lakota themselves. The Deadwood jail stank of unwashed bodies, stale whiskey, and despair. Joshua sat on a narrow cot, his back against the cold stone wall, listening to the revelry that spilled from the saloons into the muddy streets outside. 3 days had passed since Hollister and the soldiers had brought him back in chains, parading him through town like a trophy. The townspeople had jeered, spat, called him Injun lover and worse. News of a white man going native had spread like wildfire, overshadowing even Hollister's fabricated murder charges. In their eyes, Joshua had committed the greater sin, turning his back on his own kind to live among savages. Sheriff Donovan, a grizzled veteran of countless frontier skirmishes, paused outside the cell, keys jangling at his belt. "Got a visitor," he said gruffly. "Though why a man of God wants to waste time on the likes of you is beyond me." The cell door creaked open to admit a thin man in a black coat, clutching a worn Bible. Reverend Thomas Wells was younger than Joshua had expected, with earnest eyes and a nervous habit of adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "I'll be right outside, Reverend," Donovan said. "Holler if this savage gives you any trouble." When they were alone, Wells pulled up a 3-legged stool and sat facing Joshua. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm here to offer spiritual comfort in your time of need." Joshua almost laughed. "No offense, Reverend, but I'm past the point where words from that book can help me." "Perhaps," Wells conceded, with surprising candor. "But I'm also here because," he lowered his voice, glancing toward the door, "I believe you may be innocent of the charges against you." That caught Joshua's attention. "What makes you say that?" "Let's call it observation." Wells adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Hollister has become quite influential since his partner's disappearance. Generous donations to the church building fund, friendly with Judge Parker, buying rounds at the Grand Central Hotel." His eyes met Joshua's. Men secure in the righteousness of their cause rarely work so hard to curry favor. Hope, that dangerous fragile thing, flickered in Joshua's chest. "Hollister's lying. There was never any Mitchell. He shot me after we found a rich vein, left me for dead on the prairie. And the Lakota found you." Joshua nodded. "They saved my life. And you stayed with them, willingly." "It wasn't quite a question." "Yes, may I ask why?" There was genuine curiosity in the Reverend's voice. Joshua considered his answer carefully. "I found something there I never knew I was looking for. A people who understand that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by his honor, his courage, his connection to the world around him." His voice softened. "And I found someone who saw me, truly saw me, without judgment." Understanding dawned in Wells's eyes. "The rumors are true, then. You fell in love with a Lakota woman. Her name is Wicopee," Joshua said, a hint of defiance in his tone. "And yes, I love her." The Reverend was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than condemning. "Your trial is set for tomorrow. Judge Parker is known for his expediency. Hollister has 3 witnesses prepared to swear this Mitchell existed, and that you killed him." He leaned forward. "Without contradicting evidence, you'll hang by sundown." "Then I'll hang," Joshua said, resignation settling over him like a shroud. "Because there is no Mitchell, which means there's no evidence to find. Unless," Wells hesitated, "unless Hollister himself could be made to reveal the truth." Before Joshua could question him further, the cell door opened. Sheriff Donovan jerked his thumb toward the exit. "Time's up, Reverend." Wells stood, pressing his Bible into Joshua's hands. "Consider this, Mr. Blackwood. Even in the darkest hour, salvation may come from unexpected quarters." That night, unable to sleep, Joshua thumbed through the Bible the Reverend had left. A folded slip of paper fluttered to the floor. Opening it, he found a hastily scrawled message. "Courage. Friends are working on your behalf. Be ready."